participant, possibly. 2. Welcome. Well, welcome everybody, the few people that are here, the people online, to this impromptu talk on global incident response in a fragmented world. This talk is going to kind of overlap a lot with the presentation yesterday by my colleague Sherif Hashim. It's going to be about how does the international community do incident response in a world where things are getting a little bit difficult. Some time ago, there was this headline where Google security team patched a 0-day that was known to be used in a nation-state operation. The special thing about this is the nation-state operation was conducted by the US, by the very country where the Google engineers were working from. And there was a lot of conversation and controversy about, is this the right thing to do? Google argued, and I agree with this point of view, that security vulnerabilities should not be used to the detriment of users globally, and it puts the users of Google products, in this case Chrome, at risk. But is this how it works? Is this how it should be? That's a question that's discussed on the highest level, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. Today, policymakers are discussing about the rules of engagement, about how incident response teams, but how states should behave in cyberspace. This wasn't always the case. In 1996, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, John Perry Barlow, which some of you may know as the head behind the band Grateful Dead, published his Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. I recommend you read this. It really calls for states and corporations to stay out of the internet. These days are long, long gone. States have recognized that the internet is around, and they're conducting operations in the internet. Just to give you a brief overview, the first one that I know of, that's been publicly made available, was Titan Rain in 2003, nearly 20 years ago. Then where a allegedly Chinese actor attacked a US defense contractor and stole a lot of intellectual property. Then 2009, for me, this was kind of a shock. Aurora GhostNet was discovered, an attack again by the Chinese on the diaspora of the Dalai Lama, on civil society. And that, for me, was kind of a shocking thing, a state attacking civilians. But then go on, 2010, we had Stuxnet. You see here the picture of a street sign in Iran, Natanz, where this Iranian uranium enrichment facility is, that Stuxnet kind of tried to slow down or bring down to its knees. And today, we can kind of stop counting. There's so many state operations going on that it's not really worth counting. Should we be doing this? Should states be doing this? That's a very good question. Let's look back and try to figure out what is it states actually do in the internet. We read a lot about cyber war in the news recently. The Center for Foreign Relations has a website that lists all the known state operations and makes these available actually as a JSON file, so it's pretty cool. You can use this. And when you look at what states mostly do, there's somewhat of a surprise. It's not cyber war, it's espionage. States are spying on each other. That's not something new. They've always been doing this. And why are they doing this? Because it's perfectly legal. States are entitled to spy on each other. If you ask representatives of a state if that should be illegal, they all say no. States actually love this because it gives them intelligence that helps their policymakers, that helps their governments to make decisions about the capabilities or about the intentions of other states. So they don't want to give up on this. Has it become more? Well, yes, it has. Clearly, the state operations are growing. Now, you can argue, well, espionage, I mean, states have always been spying on each other. We know this. We all watch James Bond movies. Nothing new, really. Is this a problem? Has it been a problem in the past that states spied on each other? It hasn't in the past, but it has become a problem, in my view, today. If you take one of the big cyber operations in the past couple of months, the exploit of the exchange vulnerability, that has clearly been a state-sponsored operation. It has been an espionage operation because there's mostly government agencies that were affected by it. But it has had a huge collateral damage. Incident responders, people like you and me, had to kind of work overtime to fix the collaterals. Once the vulnerabilities became public, criminals jumped on it, especially ransomware groups, creating huge damages. And I think that is a game changer. Just imagine if one state spies on another one and blows up in a government building to get access to information. Nobody would tolerate this. But a nation state actually kind of conducting an operation that then leads to so much collateral damage, ransomware groups infecting hospitals and so on, no one really seems to care. And I think that is a bit of a problem. Now, why is espionage or all these cyber operations in cyberspace so much different from the same thing in the physical world? And that really is because cyberspace has some things that, in my view, are kind of different. So there's, first of all, I used to call this there's no borders in the internet, but that's kind of I'm not really even sure what the concept of borders means. But what this is about is that the sovereignty of a state, namely that you can do in your state what you want, is no longer tied to territoriality. So the internet blurs this. In the olden times, the spies had to kind of travel into your country. You could protect it for them. There was only a certain number of spies that could go in, and that is a big challenge. That sovereignty versus territoriality thing is a really big problem. It affects other parts of cyberspace. The Cloud Act, for example, is something that has to do with that, where the US tries to get information that's actually not physically stored on their territory. It's a big thing. Then attribution is hard. Really, that is still one of the biggest challenges. How can you have rules if you don't know who the actor was? And furthermore, then you have what I call class breaks. If you want to kind of rob a bank or spy on a government, all style, you have to go there. You can do one government agency at a time by kind of getting a spy, a mole in. In the internet, you can do hundreds of them at a time. We saw this in these recent big attacks. There were thousands of government agencies affected. And it's a lot easier because the rate of innovation in cyberspace, in the internet, is so high. There's barely a week where not something new comes out that you have to learn, that you as a defender have to understand how it works, and so you can protect it. Now we have the Internet of Things, where we seem to repeat all the same mistakes we've done 20 years ago in server software, and so on. That makes it a lot harder. There hasn't really been much progress in kind of securing physical buildings, and we know how to do this. Then there's the asymmetric capabilities. A few people can attack thousands of victims, and vice versa. A bunch of teenagers can actually take a government down. And that doesn't make things easier. Again, that doesn't exist in the physical world. And last but not least, there's no global authority. There's no one that really can go there and say, you did something wrong, you're going to get your finger slapped. Now, how do states react to that? Well, states actually have been recognizing this problem. And currently, there's two groups at the United Nations level that are active in this. One of the oldest one is the United Nations Governmental Group of Experts. I wrote down the full title. This is really government speech. I'm not even going to try to start reading this out. Typically, these are two-year groups. They started in 2004, and we're kind of with hand-picked states. In the beginning, 2004, there's really very few states that showed an interest, so it was not really a problem. The last one, there was quite kind of a demand, and a lot of states wanted to get into it. It was quite a competition to get into, but it is what it is. So the highlights of this UNGGE was 2013. So 2013, 9 years after they started, they came up with a report saying, hey, actually, we think international law should hold in cyberspace. So states are regulated by international law that says what you can do. For example, you must never attack another country unless you have a mandate from the Security Council or you do it in self-defense. These type of things hold in cyberspace. But what does that mean? We'll come to that. 2015, the next group actually came out with 11 what's called norms, and I'm going to explain you what norms are, of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So that was actually probably the two most successful UNGGs. Then in 2019, some people felt it's actually not okay that we only have 25 states that talk about this because the internet is becoming a global infrastructure. So they started what's called the open-ended working group, which included every country that wanted to participate. That group was restarted actually last year with a 5-year mandate. The last group didn't really have a substantial output. It reaffirmed what UNGG did, but nothing more than that. And we could go into the details. If you're into political science, you can spend a lot of time arguing about this. It was good that people talk, but not really much came out. Now, why am I telling you this? The reason is that states start making the rules on how we engage in the internet. And this has a direct effect on us. So first, feeling that we are part of the internet, we are part of the people that actually make the internet run, should play a role. The UN recognizes this and understands that the internet is not governed and owned or operated by states, and it uses what it calls a multi-stakeholder process. So if you kind of hang out in international organizations, you hear this word multi-stakeholder all the time. What it really means is you should not only listen to states, but all the other important players. And we were really lucky to be actually one of these players, first several times now presented at the United Nations to the delegates of all these states discussing these things. Just on a side remark, there's a CERT group at the United Nations. It's called the Ad Hoc Committee on Cybercrime in short, where people talk about the new cybercrime convention. Interestingly enough, cybersecurity and cybercrime at the UN level are two totally different things. The cybersecurity stuff is in what's called the first committee, the part of the UN that talks about weapons of mass destruction, so I guess it's kind of an honor to be in that part, whereas this one is more kind of on the, with the organization of drug and crime. So, yeah, I just said that. What all these bodies do is they're going to come out with norms, they're going to come out with recommendations, and that's just the UN level. There's many more organizations that come out with these. You may have heard of the Paris Call, that was a couple of years done by President Macron in France, who said this is how we should behave in cyberspace. The Best Practices Forum has put them together. There's hundreds of norms out there. Now, I've used that word quite a bit. What are norms? Today, it's pretty hard to get new international law down. International law is binding. You can, in principle, sue another state for violating this. But everybody agrees we're not going to get this working right now. People just, the atmosphere is too poisoned for that to happen. The next best thing you can do is norms. Norms are things that are not technically illegal, but you just don't do it. If you've ever tried to kind of catch a bus or so in London, UK, and I guess in Ireland, you'll notice that people queue up. There's no law that says you have to queue up. It's just something people do, and if you kind of walk the queue and try to get in first, people are going to give you a hard time, but the police is not going to show up. That's what the norm is. It's a voluntary kind of agreement. Hey, yes, we all stick to the same rules. It's often not written down. Interestingly, most of international law is what's called, now words just slipped. It's norms, it's stuff, it's customary international law. It's not written down. And it's things people have always been doing. In the past, norms have become customary international law, and after a certain time, so if states stick to this stuff for 10 years, 20 years, it actually becomes binding. They can't go back and say, okay, but we never agreed to this, because an international court would say, but you stuck to it for the past 20 years. Now, I mentioned these 15 norms that UNGG came out with, and I don't want to go through all of them in detail. I'll just point out a couple of things. And the good news really is we are in, CSIRTs are in. There's this norm K that essentially says states should not attack each other's instance response teams. CSIRTs are the only group explicitly mentioned several times in these UN negotiations, and that gives us kind of a special role. States, it seems, recognize the value of the work we do as people who defend the internet, who keep the internet running, who defend the users, and there's a prize for that. It also means we should not be offensive, we should not be part of attacks. In 2021, the UNGG also said, states, please stop politicizing CSIRTs. Do not kind of use CSIRTs as an instrument to play politics. And again, this is a very, very strong statement, I feel. It's not law, but it is something that states are encouraged to do. Now, so you may say, well, does this really kind of affect us? I mean, it's all good and right what states do. It doesn't really affect me. I mean, never ever a president has shown up at my office. So what then? And I'll give you an example. There's another norm that states should actually handle vulnerabilities responsibly. We just saw they don't do this. No one really reported these exchange vulnerabilities. Another example is the Log4j, which I think is a very interesting example because it was discovered by Alibaba, a Chinese company. Alibaba did what it was supposed to do, what we expected to do. It reported this to the developers, told them, hey, there is an issue. The developers put out an update and gave us time to fix this. Turns out the Chinese government was very, very unhappy with Alibaba. They lost a big contract because China argued, well, you should have told us about this vulnerability first before disclosing it. That's not really unique to China. The US and the UK in particular have what's called a vulnerability equity process that describes how they decide when to keep a vulnerability secret or not. The US obviously did keep a couple of vulnerabilities secret. We saw this with the first slide. And Google actually found out about the vulnerability in Chrome and patched it. So, but again, what does that mean for us? It's all states, it's just states. What are the obligations for private industry? What are the obligations for software vendors? And that is a very good question to ask, and no one really knows what this is. The Swiss government started a process called the Geneva Dialogue, where it tries to bring together people from software development companies to try to figure out what does it mean? What does it mean to do responsible vulnerability disclosure? How can we do this? Why doesn't it really work? And kind of me being the naive guy, like first has all these guidelines out, so what are you talking about? But it's really important that states start to understand what this implies and start to kind of create processes. If you look at Switzerland, Switzerland has decided to not stockpile vulnerabilities, so that's the Swiss position that's published. UK and US haven't, and no other state so far, to my knowledge, has actually made a statement on how they treat this. But even if states like the US and UK say we actually keep vulnerabilities in certain cases, them admitting this is a really good, important thing because it actually tells you where they stand and that you may have a problem there. It hasn't really solved the dilemma that Google as a US entity is in. If it finds something, if it finds another vulnerability that is used by its own government, and that is something we have to figure out. Now, I mentioned to you that FIRST has done several kind of inputs at the United Nations, but what is FIRST's position? Our position really is that it's really important that whatever norms and laws states decide on, they should make sure that incident responders can keep working the way they used to. That means you should not criminalize the tools we have. TCP dump is not a hacker tool, a malicious hacker tool. It also means we need to be able to talk to each other. Right now we're not. There's several countries that are under sanctions that we cannot talk to. That's a very important thing and that we say. We also feel that when states make decisions about what kind of operations they conduct, they should always take the good of all internet users into account. So it should not be the intelligence services that decide, hey, we have a great opportunity to catch some fish here, and we don't really care about the damage it creates to the rest of society. It's very important for us that our users are actually, at the end of the day, safe and secure. We also feel very strongly that the core of the internet, the infrastructure, deep sea cables, internet exchanges, all of this stuff should be off limits. They should not be part of a malicious cyber operation and should not be targeted, even if you could make a great gain. And last but not least, the open-ended working group has been starting to emphasize capacity building. So all states are encouraged to build capacity because they've realized actually we need CSIRTs, we need security staff, but we don't have it. What FIRST says is, well, it's not good enough to just deliver yet another CSIRT 101 training, but rather that we should start building up communities where CSIRTs learn to work together with all the stakeholders, all stuff that's really obvious to us, but not so obvious to states. And that is a position we keep on reiterating. And I think with good results, at least states agree to these statements. All these norms I've actually shown you have been agreed upon by all members of the UN General Assembly. So in principle, you can say you all said yes to that. So why aren't you sticking to this? They are not. Of course, there is a couple of problems, like attribution is one. It's not really clear who plays what role in attribution. First view here really is that CSIRTs should stay out of attribution because it kind of puts us into part of a conflict. Attribution inherently is a political process. It's one country blaming another one. We don't want to be part of the blaming game. We actually want to be part of we protect our users. We often compare ourselves to firefighters. Firefighters are not in the game of arresting arsonists. They're in the game of extinguishing fires. Obviously, they work with law enforcement to say, hey, we found this kind of bottle of gasoline here, so maybe you want to have a look at this. Sure, we do that, but we're not the ones that do attribution. There could be completely second talk about attribution. It's a really tricky topic, and if you talk to people that represent states, it becomes even trickier. At the end of the day, we start to kind of wonder at first, how should all of this work together for us? What does this really mean? And that's kind of a little PR session for our own code of ethics, ethics first, that there's a SIG and ethics SIG at first that started talking about what does this do? It's really based on the fairly old Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what we actually feel is that what we do as instance responders, we protect users. What we really protect is their basic rights. The Code of Ethics is not very much into human rights. It just says that in one sentence. But what it delivers you is kind of duties. For example, the duty to reply to a request, duty to be trustworthy, and so on. And we acknowledge that there is often dilemmas because the work we do is not always easy. Are we going to kind of publish something, a vulnerability that then can be abused by someone, or are we going to keep it secret, just tell it to some small group? These are difficult questions. And the Code of Ethics tries to kind of give you advice on that and guidance on how to find a solution that really fits to you. That already brings me to the end of the talk, and I think, why do I give these non-technical talks, why I talk about this? It's because I really feel, as much as policymakers need to learn how the internet works and how instance responders work, we need to understand that we're not the only ones in the internet anymore, that there is policymakers, that there is states and authorities that use and abuse and regulate the internet. And we all together need to work on a way to make the internet a better place for our users and for mankind. It's more than half the population of this planet now is on the internet. For some people, it is very much on it. It's very much kind of their entire lives are in it. If you go to certain nations in Africa, the lives and the goods people own are all tied to a mobile phone. If that's compromised, we have a problem. They have a problem. And that's what we try to solve. that's it from my side. Any questions?
Sorry, thank you for that talk. This is not really a question, but could you elaborate a bit on how do you interpret borders on the internet? In terms that most of the infrastructure is owned by private entities, which are then governed by state entities, etc., and how that falls into this?
That is indeed a very good question, and I know there's a couple of international lawyers that are hard at work and trying to exactly figure this out. I would argue the concept of binary borders where two entities touch on each other, they're gone. So when we look at cloud services, we have the location of the data center that potentially gives the state where this data center is located in access to all the information in that data set. Then we have the customer who may be in a different country, and we have the service provider who's going to be yet in another country. So there's at least 3 entities in there. And I think what it will have to come down to is that states need to start to come to agreements in how they treat this. The US Cloud Act is one attempt to do so. If you study the Cloud Act, it actually says what cloud providers are, US cloud providers are obliged to do if the US government comes. But it also says countries are free to have specific agreements with the United States to change these rules a little bit. So I think at the end of the day, sooner or later, we will have to come to grips with how are we going to deal with this territoriality thing. Can we kind of come up with an internet territoriality or jurisdiction? But right now, that's an unsolved problem. No one really knows. Great question.
Hey, Serge, was ASN hijacking part of the conversation at all?
Sorry,
ASN hijacking, so basically the hijacking by telecoms communicators of data packs, was that part of the conversation at all?
So I guess it's a good question. So I guess it's talking about like what happened that China, for example, started to attract certain traffic to route it through its own system so it can spy on it. You can ask a similar question: is it okay to actually kind of listen, snoop into deep sea cables? And that hasn't really been part of the conversation. You could argue that when people say, hey, you should leave the core of the internet alone and not fiddle around with this, that should kind of be a message. You shouldn't really fiddle around with the global routing tables. As for sea cables, it's actually totally legal to intercept these. Everything outside the 200-mile zone is open for grabs, and you can do with this stuff whatever you want to. So that was kind of like the first time I talked to an international lawyer, and he asked me, is the law of the seas relevant to the internet? Yes, it is, because it permits you to listen into deep sea cables.
Any more questions? Thank you, Serge. Thank you for coming. And for stepping in a short notice.
Yes,
yeah.
and thanks everybody for rushing from the dessert to my talk. Much appreciated.
Next talk is at 3 o'clock here in this room. Fill out the survey, recognizing Serge for stepping in. And yeah, a short break. Next speaker. Thanks.